Marcus's morning had started with a mix of nervousness and joy. He was only 16, tall but still carrying the quiet awkwardness of his teenage years. Today, however, was different. His mother had surprised him with a first-class ticket for their trip across the country. It wasn't something their family did often, but she had used her airline reward points to give him the experience. For Marcus, it was more than just a flight, it was a small dream come true. As he walked into the airport with his backpack slung over one shoulder, he kept checking the boarding pass in his hand. Printed clearly on the paper were the words "First Class." Every time he looked at it, his heart beat a little faster. He imagined the wide seats, the quiet cabin, the chance to stretch out his legs. It felt like stepping into a world that always seemed reserved for someone else. When the boarding announcement came, Marcus lined up, his palms sweating slightly. The gate agent scanned his pass, smiled, and told him to enjoy his flight. That simple kindness gave him courage. He stepped onto the jet bridge, trying to look calm, though inside his chest was bursting with excitement. The moment he entered the first-class cabin, he noticed the difference. The seats looked larger, and the lighting seemed softer. A flight attendant smiled and pointed him toward his row. Marcus found his seat, sat down carefully, and placed his backpack under the seat in front of him. He took a deep breath, thinking of how proud his mother would be that he was experiencing something new. But not everyone shared his joy. A middle-aged woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes when she saw him. She wore a neat blazer and carried herself with an air of authority, as if the entire cabin belonged to her. She whispered something to the man beside her, then looked back at Marcus, her eyes full of doubt. At first, Marcus tried to ignore it. He took out a book and began flipping through the pages. Yet, the woman's gaze kept burning into him. After a moment, she leaned forward, her voice sharp but quiet enough to seem polite. "Young man, are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly, showing her his boarding pass. She gave a short laugh, the kind that wasn't friendly. "That can't be right. First-class seats aren't usually, well, they're not for everyone. Maybe you should check again." Marcus felt his ears grow warm. He wanted to melt into his seat. Still, he kept his composure. "It says first class," he replied, keeping his tone respectful. The woman frowned, shaking her head. She pressed the call button for the flight attendant. Within seconds, a kind-faced attendant arrived. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "This boy seems to be in the wrong place," the woman declared. "I think he wandered into first class by mistake." The attendant looked at Marcus, then at the woman. With a patient smile, she asked Marcus for his boarding pass. He handed it over without hesitation. She scanned it quickly and confirmed, "He is in the right seat. Everything is fine." The woman's lips tightened. She did not look satisfied. "That doesn't make sense. Maybe the system is wrong. People don't just sit here without reason. I want this checked properly." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The attendant reassured him with a smile before walking away, but the woman kept staring, her suspicion growing. Other passengers in the cabin were beginning to notice. A few shook their heads quietly, but no one spoke yet. The boy gripped the edges of his seat. He thought of his mother, of how she always told him to be calm, to carry himself with dignity no matter what others said. He tried to remember her words. But inside, he felt a storm of emotions: confusion, embarrassment, and a little fear. As the boarding continued, the woman leaned closer, lowering her voice but not enough to hide the edge in it. "I don't know how you got that ticket, but I don't believe it. You shouldn't be here." Marcus didn't answer this time. He kept his eyes on his book, though the words blurred in front of him. The air felt heavier. He could sense the weight of judgment pressing down on him. Minutes later, the woman raised her voice again, demanding to see a supervisor. She told the crew that she wanted the police called before the plane left the gate. "This has to be handled," she insisted. Marcus's heart dropped. The word police echoed in his mind. He had done nothing wrong, but the idea of officers boarding the plane because of him filled him with dread. He sat still, gripping his boarding pass like a lifeline. Around him, the cabin had grown tense. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered quietly, wondering why the woman was making such a scene over a boy sitting in his assigned seat. Marcus looked out the small oval window beside him, trying to distract himself. The runway stretched wide in the distance, and he longed for the plane to take off, to leave this uncomfortable moment behind. But he knew it wasn't over yet. The murmurs grew, the tension rising like a tide. For Marcus, those first few minutes in the first-class cabin became a test of patience and strength. He didn't know that within 5 minutes, everything would change and the woman who doubted him would soon regret her actions. Deep lithe cabin was filled with a quiet tension that grew heavier with every passing minute. Marcus sat still in his wide seat, trying not to look around too much. He could feel eyes on him, though some were kind, others uncertain, and a few held doubt, just like the woman across the aisle. She had folded her arms tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear she was not ready to let the matter rest. The flight attendant had already confirmed that Marcus was in the right place, but the woman shook her head and muttered under her breath. "This is unbelievable. There must be some mistake." She glanced toward the back of the plane, as if expecting Marcus to stand up and leave for the economy cabin. But he did not move. Marcus lowered his gaze to his lap, holding his boarding pass carefully between his fingers. He thought about his mother's words that morning, how she had told him, "You belong wherever your ticket says you belong. Hold your head up." He tried to hold on to that, but the knot in his stomach tightened. Soon, the woman pressed the call button again. This time, her voice was louder. "Excuse me. I need a supervisor here right now. I don't believe this boy belongs in this section. I want this checked properly." The attendant returned, her calmness still steady, but there was a trace of weariness in her smile. "Ma'am, I've already checked. His seat is correct." The woman leaned closer, her voice sharp. "Then call security. Call the police if you have to. I don't feel comfortable with him here." Her words were enough to draw the full attention of nearby passengers. A man in a business suit frowned, shaking his head. A young couple whispered to each other, clearly disturbed by the commotion. The flight attendant took a quiet breath, then nodded politely. "I'll notify the gate," she said softly, though it was clear she did not agree with the woman's behavior. Marcus sat frozen. His heart thudded in his chest. He thought of all the stories he had heard where misunderstandings grew larger than they should have. He wanted to speak up, to say something that would clear the air, but his voice felt trapped inside. Within minutes, the supervisor arrived at the cabin door. He was calm, professional, and asked what the problem was. The woman wasted no time, pointing her finger at Marcus. "This boy is sitting in first class, but I don't believe he has a right to be here. I demand that someone check properly before we leave." The supervisor glanced at Marcus kindly and asked to see his ticket. Marcus handed it over, his fingers trembling slightly. The supervisor scanned it with a handheld device and smiled. "This is correct. He is assigned to this seat. There's no mistake." But the woman would not let go. "That doesn't prove anything. He probably switched with someone, or maybe he printed a fake ticket." "How do you know?" The supervisor's patience was tested, but he remained calm. "Ma'am, our system verifies this. There is nothing wrong. He is exactly where he is supposed to be." The woman crossed her arms again, but her eyes darted around as if searching for support. A few passengers avoided her gaze, but some shook their heads openly now. A man in the next row finally spoke. "Ma'am, you're making a scene for no reason. The boy has his ticket. Leave him alone." She turned toward him, flustered. "I'm just trying to keep things safe. You don't know what people are capable of these days." Those words cut through Marcus like a cold wind. He lowered his head again, wishing he could disappear into the seat. The supervisor gave a small nod to the flight attendant, who quietly stepped away to make a call. Marcus didn't know it yet, but the woman had insisted so strongly that she had left them no choice. The gate security and 2 police officers were already being called to the cabin. The minutes felt like hours. Marcus shifted uneasily, staring at the floor. Around him, whispers grew. The young couple nearby spoke gently about how unfair it seemed. A grandmotherly woman in the row ahead leaned slightly back, giving Marcus a sympathetic look. "You're okay, dear," she whispered kindly, though her words were soft enough that the accuser didn't hear. The woman across the aisle, however, seemed more restless than ever. She tapped her nails on the armrest, muttering things under her breath about standards and how times have changed. Her voice was filled with judgment, and every word made Marcus's chest tighten further. Finally, movement came from the front of the plane. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the cabin, their presence instantly drawing everyone's attention. The murmurs hushed. Passengers watched closely, knowing the situation was about to escalate. The woman's eyes lit up with a strange satisfaction. She sat taller in her seat and immediately pointed across the aisle. "Officers, over here. This is the boy I was telling you about. He doesn't belong here." Marcus felt the world slow around him. His hands gripped the edge of the seat, and his heart pounded so loudly he thought others might hear it. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, but for now, he sat still, waiting. The officers walked toward him, their expressions calm but serious. One of them asked for his boarding pass. Marcus handed it over quietly, his fingers trembling just a little. He hoped, more than anything, that the truth would be clear and that this moment would pass quickly. The woman leaned forward again, speaking with confidence. "See? You'll find out he doesn't belong." "I knew it the moment he sat down." The officers scanned the pass carefully. They exchanged a quick look, then one of them nodded slowly. "This ticket checks out," he said. The woman blinked in surprise. "What? No, that can't be right. Check again." The officer's voice was steady, firm. "Ma'am, his seat is valid. He belongs here." And with those words, the balance of the cabin began to shift. Some passengers nodded in quiet approval, others exchanged glances as if they had been waiting for the truth to finally be spoken aloud. The tension was still thick, but something had changed. The woman's certainty was beginning to falter, and Marcus, though still quiet, felt a small spark of relief ignite inside him. The stage was set for what would come next, the revelation that would not only clear Marcus but also turn the spotlight back onto the woman who had accused him. And in just a few minutes, her regret would be stronger than she ever expected. The cabin grew very quiet as the 2 officers stood in front of Marcus. The woman who had complained earlier still looked certain of herself. She sat tall in her seat, waiting for the officers to say the words she expected. That Marcus was in the wrong place. Her fingers tapped the armrest in impatience. For her, this was the moment of victory. But it didn't come. One officer, a tall man with a calm voice, looked at Marcus kindly. "Son, this is your ticket," he asked. "Yes, sir," Marcus answered softly, his voice steady even though his heart was beating hard. He handed over the ticket again, though it had already been checked many times. The officer scanned it with his small device, nodded, and showed it to his partner. "It's valid," he said firmly. "Seat 3A. This is his assigned place." The words hung in the air. For a moment, the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. The woman across the aisle frowned, leaning forward. No, no, no. You must be making a mistake. That boy does not belong here. Look at him. He's just a kid. First class it isn't for people like him. Her voice carried through the cabin, sharp and insistent. But this time, instead of nods of agreement, she was met with silence and a few disgusted looks from other passengers. The officer straightened up, his expression firm. Ma'am, we've checked. The young man is in the correct seat. There is no issue here. The woman's face reddened. She turned quickly to the passengers near her, as if searching for support. Can't you all see it? This doesn't feel right. Someone has to say something. But the silence of the cabin told her everything she needed to know. People were not siding with her. In fact, many passengers looked annoyed at her constant interruptions. Marcus, though still shaken, sat quietly in his seat. He had kept his composure, just as his mother always told him to. He didn't need to argue or shout, the truth was already showing itself. The second officer, a woman with a gentle but firm tone, turned to Marcus. Thank you for staying calm, she said softly. You've done nothing wrong. This is your place, and you're welcome to stay right here. Those words brought Marcus a wave of relief, though he tried not to show it too much. He nodded, whispering, "Thank you." The first officer now faced the woman directly. His voice was respectful, but it carried authority. "Ma'am, you've made a very serious complaint. You asked for police intervention, and we came. We investigated, and everything is fine. The passenger is where he belongs." The woman opened her mouth to argue again, but the officer raised his hand slightly. "Enough. If you continue this behavior, you may be removed from the flight." The entire cabin shifted with quiet energy. A few passengers exchanged glances of approval. Some even allowed small smiles to cross their faces. It was clear now that the tables had turned. The woman's confidence faltered. She leaned back in her seat, her lips pressed tightly together. But the flush in her cheeks revealed her embarrassment. One of the passengers, a man in his 50s wearing a gray suit, spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "This is ridiculous. That boy showed his ticket 3 times already. Let him be." Another voice, this time from the back of the cabin, added, "She's the one causing trouble, not him." For Marcus, these voices felt like small lifelines. He had been alone in silence for so long, but now others were beginning to speak up. The officers turned to him once more. "You're free to enjoy your flight," the taller officer said. "If anyone bothers you again, let the crew know immediately." Marcus nodded, clutching his backpack tightly for comfort. He whispered, "Thank you, sir." Then something unexpected happened. As the officers prepared to leave, the taller one glanced at Marcus's boarding pass again. He looked at the name written there and paused for a moment. Then he asked, "Are you related to Dr. Elaine Carter?" Marcus blinked in surprise. "Yes," he answered softly. "She's my mom." The officer's expression shifted, his face lighting up in recognition. "Dr. Carter? The businesswoman who started the scholarship program for underprivileged kids?" Marcus nodded again, a little shyly. "That's her." The officer's tone grew warmer. "I've heard of her. She's done a lot of good work. You must be proud." Marcus felt his chest swell with quiet pride. "Yes, sir. I am." The passengers who overheard this exchanged murmurs of recognition. Some nodded with newfound respect. The whispers began to spread through the cabin, "His mom is Dr. Carter? Oh, I've read about her." The woman across the aisle stiffened in her seat, her embarrassment deepening. She had made a scene, accused Marcus unfairly, and now it turned out the boy was not only in the right seat but also the son of a respected woman known for her kindness and generosity. The irony of the moment could not have been sharper. The officers handed Marcus's ticket back with a smile. "Have a safe flight, son. And tell your mother some of us really appreciate the work she's doing." "Thank you," Marcus replied quietly. The officers turned to leave the cabin, but before they did, one of them addressed the woman firmly. "Ma'am, you need to understand something. Making false accusations wastes time, creates tension, and can even delay flights. It's unfair to the passenger you accused, and it's unfair to everyone else on board." The woman tried to respond, but her words came out in a nervous stammer. "I was just. I thought. I didn't mean," but her excuses sounded weak now. The authority of the officers, the truth of Marcus's ticket, and the growing disapproval of the passengers had cornered her. She sank back into her seat, no longer bold, her eyes darting around the cabin to avoid the stairs. Marcus exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over him. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself to lean back in his seat and relax. The tension in his shoulders eased. He knew this wasn't over yet, there was still the sting of being unfairly judged, but at least the truth had spoken louder than prejudice. The flight attendant returned with a warm smile. "Can I get you something to drink, sweetheart?" she asked Marcus kindly. "You've been through a lot already, and the plane hasn't even left the ground." Marcus smiled faintly and nodded. "Water, please." As she walked away, the cabin returned to its quiet hum, but the atmosphere had changed. The shame of the woman's actions hung in the air, and passengers couldn't help but glance at her with disapproval. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence gone. Marcus sipped his water slowly, his hands still a little shaky. He looked out the window, watching the ground crew move around outside. The plane would soon take off, and he told himself to focus on that, the excitement of flying first class, the adventure ahead, the pride of knowing he had stayed calm. Inside, though, he also knew something else. The woman who had doubted him, accused him, and called the police on him was already beginning to feel regret. And as the flight continued, that regret would only grow stronger. The plane cabin had settled back into a tense silence after the officers left. Marcus still sat upright in his wide seat, his backpack tucked carefully at his feet. He felt both relief and heaviness inside him. The relief came from knowing the officers had cleared everything up, he belonged here, and there was no mistake. But the heaviness came from the sting of the whole scene. He had been judged in front of strangers, embarrassed, and made to feel small even when he had done nothing wrong. The woman across the aisle tried to sit normally, but her stiff posture gave her away. Her cheeks were still pink with embarrassment. She glanced around from time to time, hoping maybe someone would nod at her in agreement or at least look sympathetic. But the truth was plain, no one was on her side anymore. Passengers avoided her eyes, and some looked openly displeased whenever she moved. A flight attendant returned to check on Marcus, smiling kindly. She set a glass of water on his tray table and leaned in slightly. "You handled yourself so well," she whispered, her tone filled with warmth. "That must have been hard." Marcus gave her a small, polite smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but his chest still felt tight. As boarding finished, the captain announced that they would be departing shortly. The plane began to push back from the gate, and Marcus looked out of the window again. He wanted to focus on the simple beauty of takeoff, the way the ground fell away as the plane climbed into the sky. He wanted this flight to be remembered for that, not for the confrontation that had already taken place. But the woman wasn't done. As the plane taxied toward the runway, she leaned toward the flight attendant, her voice sharp but quieter this time. "Are you sure the system didn't make a mistake? People can trick these machines, you know. Someone should double-check." The attendant's professional smile didn't falter, but her eyes held firmness. "Ma'am, everything has already been checked by both the crew and the police. The young man has every right to sit in this seat." I would kindly ask you to enjoy your flight. The woman leaned back, clearly unsatisfied, but she didn't push further. Still, her restless shifting and muttering showed her regret was not yet humility, it was the regret of someone who realized her words had no more power. When the plane finally lifted into the sky, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Marcus pressed his head back against the seat, watching the earth get smaller beneath him. The moment of rising above the clouds felt like freedom, like a reminder that he could rise above judgments too. After the seatbelt sign went off, the crew began serving drinks. The man in the gray suit sitting a row ahead turned back and gave Marcus a small smile. "Don't let that bother you, son," he said warmly. "You belong here as much as anyone else. Don't forget that." Marcus nodded, appreciating the kindness. "Thank you, sir." The young couple across the aisle also smiled at him. The woman whispered softly, "She was wrong." "You did nothing wrong." Marcus gave another small nod. Their support didn't erase the sting of what happened, but it softened the weight he felt on his chest. As the service continued, the cabin began to feel lighter again. Passengers started settling in with their books, laptops, or headphones. But the woman sat stiff and quiet, her earlier boldness gone. She picked at the edge of her napkin, her eyes lowered, and the weight of disapproval around her was impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that made her regret deeper. One of the officers had recognized Marcus's mother, Dr. Elaine Carter. That detail had spread quietly through the cabin like a whisper in the wind. Now, more passengers knew exactly who Marcus was. A man from across the aisle leaned slightly forward and asked Marcus in a respectful tone, "Are you really Dr. Carter's son?" Marcus hesitated, but then nodded. "Yes, sir." The man's eyes widened with admiration. "She's doing amazing work. My niece got a scholarship from her program. Please tell her thank you from our family." Other passengers overheard and joined in. A woman further down smiled and said, "I've read about her in the news. She's remarkable. You must be so proud." Marcus's cheeks grew warm, but this time it wasn't embarrassment. It was pride. "I am," he said softly. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, this time even more strongly. Respect grew around Marcus like a quiet shield. The passengers now looked at him not just as a boy who had been unfairly judged, but as the son of a woman who had touched many lives. The woman across the aisle shrank further into her seat. Her earlier words about him not belonging now rang louder in her own ears. She had not only been wrong but had insulted someone connected to a figure admired by many. As the meal service began, the flight attendant returned with a special tray for Marcus. "This is from the crew," she said kindly. "A small way to make up for the trouble earlier." The tray had extra treats, something usually offered to special guests. Marcus blinked in surprise. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. Passengers noticed this gesture too. A few smiled warmly at him, and the kindness in their eyes was unmistakable. Meanwhile, the woman sat stiff, ignored by everyone. The hours passed, and the regret on her face only deepened. She avoided looking at Marcus, but it was impossible not to see the contrast. Where he had been calm, respectful, and composed, she had been loud, insistent, and wrong. Now the entire cabin had witnessed the difference. Marcus leaned back in his seat, slowly letting himself relax. He thought about his mother again, how she always said that dignity was stronger than anger, that truth didn't need to shout. And now he understood it better than ever. The plane soared smoothly above the clouds, but inside the cabin, a silent lesson hung heavy. Prejudice had spoken loudly, but truth and patience had spoken louder. And for the woman who had tried to cast Marcus out, regret had already begun to grow into something she would carry far beyond this flight. She stared out of her window, her reflection faint in the glass, knowing that 5 minutes of rash judgment had left her alone in shame, While the boy she doubted had earned respect without saying more than a few quiet words. The plane glided smoothly above the clouds. The soft hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin, but beneath that steady sound, a quiet story lingered in the air. Marcus sat calmly in his seat, sipping from his glass of water and looking out the window. The sight of the endless sky comforted him, but his mind kept going back to what had just happened. He was relieved it was over, yet the memory of being doubted and accused still weighed heavy on his chest. The woman across the aisle could not find peace either. She shifted in her seat, crossed her arms, then uncrossed them again. Every so often she stole a glance at Marcus, only to quickly look away. The glow of pride around him and the respect of the passengers made her feel even smaller. Her earlier confidence had completely disappeared. She had called the police, humiliated a young boy, and now realized she had been wrong from the very beginning. Marcus's quiet dignity only made her regret sharper. He had not raised his voice, argued, or caused trouble. He simply showed his ticket, remained calm, and let the truth reveal itself. That truth had placed her, not him, in the center of shame. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, serving meals. When they stopped at Marcus's seat, one of them placed a tray in front of him with a smile. "Here you go, sweetheart. We added a little extra for you." Marcus looked down and noticed that his meal was served with extra care, a few special items not offered to everyone. He looked up in surprise, but the attendant only smiled warmly and walked away. The man in the gray suit, sitting ahead, turned slightly in his seat and said in a low, kind voice, "You've handled yourself better than many adults I've seen. That's something to be proud of." Marcus nodded softly, whispering, "Thank you." The couple across the aisle leaned over too, offering a friendly smile. "Ignore what happened earlier," the woman said gently. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Don't ever doubt that." Marcus smiled faintly. "I won't." As he ate his meal, Marcus thought about his mother again. She had always told him that his strength would come from patience, not anger. He remembered her exact words, "People may question you, but if you stand tall and stay calm, the truth will defend you." Those words echoed in his heart now. She had been right. The passengers around him began to relax again, returning to their books, headphones, and quiet conversations. But still, the shadow of the earlier event lingered. The woman who had caused all the trouble sat alone in her shame. No one around her tried to comfort her. In fact, when she asked the flight attendant for a glass of wine, the attendant's smile was polite but cold. "Yes, ma'am," she said, but there was no warmth in her voice. The woman sipped her drink slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Inside her, a storm of regret brewed. She realized how quickly she had judged the boy. She had seen only his skin, his age, and her own assumptions. She had not bothered to believe his words or trust the proof right in front of her. Instead, she had demanded police intervention, embarrassing him in front of everyone. Now she carried the heavy knowledge that she had been wrong. Halfway through the flight, Marcus got up to stretch his legs. He walked carefully down the aisle, his shoulders straight. A few passengers nodded at him as he passed, small gestures of respect and support. He felt their eyes on him, but this time it wasn't the stare of suspicion, it was the gaze of admiration. When he returned to his seat, he noticed the woman across the aisle watching him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she quickly looked away. But in that moment, Marcus saw something in her face: shame, maybe even guilt. Later, as the flight attendants cleared the trays, the woman finally spoke, her voice low and unsteady. "Young man," she said, not quite meeting his eyes, I may have misunderstood earlier." Marcus looked at her calmly. He didn't answer right away. He just studied her for a moment, his expression steady but not unkind. Finally, he said softly, "Yes, ma'am." She opened her mouth as if to say more, but the words didn't come. Instead, she nodded awkwardly and looked back down at her hands. The regret in her heart grew heavier with every passing mile. She knew she had embarrassed herself in front of an entire cabin. She knew her assumptions had hurt someone who had done nothing wrong. And she knew this moment would stay with her long after the flight ended. As the hours passed, Marcus relaxed more. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and listened to music. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself to enjoy the comfort of first class. The soft seat, the space to stretch his legs, the quiet atmosphere, all of it felt like a gift he deserved. He thought of his mother again and smiled, imagining how proud she would be when he told her the full story. When the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the speaker, thanking passengers for flying. The cabin filled with the familiar bustle of trays being collected, seat belts clicking, and windows opening to let in the light. Marcus looked out at the city below as it grew larger. The buildings sparkled in the afternoon sun, the roads winding like ribbons. The sight filled him with calm. The woman across the aisle, however, sat silently. She glanced at Marcus one last time, her eyes full of regret. She wanted to apologize fully, to admit she had been wrong, but the courage never came. Instead, she sat with her silence, carrying her mistake like a heavy weight. When the plane landed and rolled to the gate, passengers began gathering their things. Some smiled at Marcus again, wishing him well. The man in the suit gave him a small nod of respect. The young couple whispered, "Take care." Marcus stood, pulled his backpack onto his shoulder, and walked down the aisle with steady steps. He didn't rush, and he didn't shrink. He walked with quiet dignity, the same dignity his mother had taught him to carry. Behind him, the woman sat frozen for a moment longer. She clutched her bag tightly, her face pale. Her regret was complete now. She realized she had not only misjudged a boy but also revealed her own prejudice in front of strangers who would never forget her behavior. As Marcus walked into the bright light of the terminal, he breathed deeply. The air felt fresh, full of possibility. He had gone through something unfair, but he had come out stronger. He knew the lesson now: the truth always rises, and patience can silence even the loudest doubt. The woman stepped off the plane a few minutes later, her head bowed. The regret in her heart would follow her long after that flight. And though Marcus never looked back, she would always remember the boy she had wrongly accused, the boy who taught her, without even trying, that respect is earned not through suspicion, but through truth and dignity.